Imagine a man who alone defied one of the greatest empires in Europe, a warrior who, with his courage and strategy, led an entire nation in the fight for freedom. This man was William Wallace, the Scottish hero whose story inspired the film Braveheart. But do you truly know the truth behind the legend? At the turn of the 13th to the 14th century, Scotland was under English rule. King Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots, imposed oppressive laws and stripped the people of their freedom. It was in this scenario that William Wallace emerged as an unlikely leader, uniting rival clans and leading a fierce resistance against the English. His story is not just a battle for territory, but a fight for the identity and freedom of a people. Scotland in those dark days was a land divided. The English crown had taken advantage of a succession crisis after the death of King Alexander III, leaving the Scottish nobility torn between loyalty to their homeland and submission to English power. Common folk suffered under harsh taxation and brutal English sheriffs who enforced Edward's rule with an iron fist. Into this cauldron of tension stepped a man from humble origins. Not born to nobility or destined for leadership by birth, Wallace became the embodiment of Scottish defiance through circumstance and sheer force of will. His rise to prominence would forever change the course of Scottish history and challenge the might of medieval England. But what drove this ordinary man to extraordinary acts of courage? What inner fire transformed him from an outlaw to a national symbol of resistance? The answers lie in a tale of personal tragedy, unwavering conviction, and a fierce love of homeland that transcended death itself. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of the great empires, like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we separate fact from fiction and discover the real William Wallace. A man whose legacy continues to echo through the centuries, inspiring freedom fighters around the world to this day. Unlike the nobles who often dominated medieval conflicts, William Wallace was born to humble beginnings. The son of a small landowner in Elderslie, his family held modest status, certainly not the makings of someone destined to challenge a king. But history often finds its heroes in unexpected places. Wallace received an education uncommon for common folk at that time. Some accounts suggest he was taught by monks who recognized his sharp intellect. He grew tall and strong, a commanding physical presence that would later serve him well on the battlefield. But it wasn't ambition or a thirst for power that thrust Wallace into the pages of history. It was tragedy that transformed him from an ordinary man into a freedom fighter. In 1297, English soldiers killed his wife, Marion Braveheart, in a brutal act that shattered Wallace's world. Some chronicles suggest the English targeted her specifically to draw out Wallace, who had already shown signs of resistance to English authority. Others tell that she was simply caught in the cruel machinery of occupation. Regardless of the exact circumstances, her death became the catalyst for Wallace's rebellion. Grief transformed into righteous fury as he gathered other Scots who had suffered similar injustices under English rule. What began as personal vengeance soon became something much greater, a movement for national liberation. Wallace proved remarkably skilled at inspiring loyalty. Peasants who had never lifted anything more dangerous than farming tools became soldiers under his command. Even some disgruntled Scottish nobles, frustrated with English dominance, lent their support. Wallace unified people across Scotland's traditional clan divisions, something that had rarely happened before. His crowning achievement came at Stirling Bridge in September 1297. The English army, nearly 3 times larger than Wallace's forces and far better equipped, approached with supreme confidence. Led by the Earl of Surrey and Hugh de Cressingham, the English cavalry and heavily armoured infantry had to cross a narrow bridge to reach the Scottish position. Wallace and his co-commander, Andrew Moray, showed brilliant tactical thinking. They waited patiently as the English slowly filed across the bridge, then attacked when only a portion had crossed. The narrow bridge prevented English reinforcements from coming to their comrades' aid. The Scots fell upon the isolated English troops with such ferocity that many, weighted down by heavy armor, drowned in the River Forth while attempting to retreat. It was a stunning victory that sent shockwaves throughout Europe. A ragtag army of commoners had defeated England's professional soldiers. After the battle, Wallace was knighted and named Guardian of Scotland, a meteoric rise for a man of such humble origins. Did you know that William Wallace's sword was truly legendary? Measuring around 5 feet and 6 inches long, it remains one of the largest medieval swords ever discovered. This massive weapon, which would be unwieldy for an average man, speaks to Wallace's extraordinary physical strength. Today, this impressive blade is displayed at the Wallace Monument in Scotland, standing as a powerful symbol of his strength and determination. Historians believe that only a man of exceptional height and power could effectively wield such a weapon in battle. Another reason why Wallace's presence on the battlefield was so intimidating to his enemies. The victory at Stirling Bridge did more than secure Wallace's place in history. It rekindled hope in a nation that had nearly surrendered to despair. For the first time, the Scottish people believed they could resist English dominance. From son of a minor landowner to guardian of Scotland, Wallace's rise embodied the spirit of resistance that would define Scotland for generations to come. The stunning victory at Stirling Bridge transformed William Wallace from rebel leader to national hero overnight. In recognition of his extraordinary achievement, he was bestowed with the title Guardian of Scotland, the highest honor for a man born without noble blood. For a brief moment, it seemed that David had truly vanquished Goliath, and the Scottish people dared to dream of lasting freedom. But King Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. The news of his army's humiliation at Stirling Bridge sent him into a cold rage. This was the king who had conquered Wales and subdued rebellious barons. He would not allow a Scottish commoner to tarnish his legacy. Edward personally gathered the largest invasion force England had seen in generations. By the summer of 1298, barely a year after Wallace's triumph, nearly 15,000 English soldiers marched northward, with Edward himself leading the campaign. Wallace understood that he couldn't match such overwhelming numbers in direct combat. Instead, he implemented a scorched earth strategy, burning crops, destroying provisions, and evacuating villages along the English army's path. His plan was to starve the massive English force and force their retreat without risking battle. It was a sound strategy that might have worked, if not for the growing tensions among the Scottish nobility. You see, Wallace's very success had become a source of resentment among many Scottish nobles. How could a commoner rise so high? The aristocratic lords who had initially supported him now questioned his authority. Their lands were being sacrificed in his scorched earth policy, while their traditional privileges seemed threatened by this charismatic upstart who commanded the people's love. Intelligence reached Edward about Wallace's position near Falkirk, and on July 22, 1298, the English king seized his opportunity. The battle that followed revealed how military technology and class division could determine the fate of nations. Wallace arranged his infantry into circular formations called schiltrons, tight defensive circles bristling with long spears that had proven effective against cavalry at Stirling Bridge. He positioned his archers between these formations and kept a small cavalry force in reserve. On paper, it was a solid defensive plan. But Edward was a brilliant tactician who had fought in crusades and numerous campaigns. He began by unleashing the devastating power of English longbowmen, soldiers who trained from childhood to draw bows with extraordinary power and accuracy. Arrows rained down on the Scottish positions, decimating Wallace's limited archer force and creating gaps in the schiltrons. Then came the hammer blow. Edward's heavy cavalry charged the Scottish formations. Unlike at Stirling Bridge, where the narrow crossing limited English maneuverability, at Falkirk the horsemen had open ground to build momentum. Even more devastating, the Scottish noble cavalry, perhaps out of jealousy or tactical disagreement, abandoned the field rather than countercharging. Some historians suggest this was simple cowardice, while others believe it was calculated betrayal. Whatever the reason, the result was catastrophic. Without cavalry protection, the Scottish schiltrons were isolated and vulnerable. Edward's knights smashed into the Scottish formations again and again. Though many common Scottish soldiers fought bravely to the death, the battle became a slaughter. Wallace barely escaped with his life, watching his army disintegrate and his dream of Scottish independence crumble on the blood-soaked field of Falkirk. The aftermath was perhaps even more painful than the defeat itself. Wallace resigned as Guardian of Scotland, knowing his position was untenable. While some accounts suggest he travelled to France seeking support from King Philip IV, others believe he continued guerrilla resistance from the Scottish Highlands. Either way, he had fallen from the heights of power to become a fugitive with a massive price on his head. For 7 long years, Wallace evaded capture, moving through forests and highlands, sheltered by common folk who still believed in him, even as the aristocracy turned their backs. Some nobles actively hunted him, hoping to curry favour with King Edward. The English king, for his part, brutally punished anyone suspected of harbouring Wallace. The final betrayal came in 1305, when Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish nobleman who had once fought alongside Wallace, arranged his capture near Glasgow. For 30 pieces of silver, or more accurately, lands and titles promised by the English, Menteith delivered Scotland's hero to his enemies. To this day in Scotland, the name Menteith remains synonymous with treachery. The capture of Wallace represented not just the end of one man's resistance, but exposed the deep divisions within Scottish society that repeatedly undermined the struggle for independence. While common Scots viewed Wallace as a hero, many nobles saw him as a threat to their own power and privilege, a tragic pattern that would repeat itself throughout Scotland's long fight for freedom. In August 1305, the man who had become Scotland's greatest symbol of resistance was finally captured. After years of evading the English, William Wallace was betrayed by his fellow Scotsman, Sir John de Menteith, and handed over to English soldiers near Glasgow. Bound in chains and placed upon a horse, Wallace began the long, humiliating journey to London. Picture this: the once mighty warrior who had commanded armies and struck fear into the hearts of English soldiers, now paraded through towns and villages as a common criminal. English citizens lined the streets, hurling insults and debris at the man King Edward had vilified as the most dangerous rebel in the realm. When Wallace finally arrived in Westminster Hall, he faced a sham trial that had only one possible outcome. The charges against him were read in excruciating detail: murder, treason, and rebellion against the crown. But it was what happened next that cemented Wallace's place in history. Standing tall despite his chains, Wallace looked his accusers in the eye and delivered words that would echo through centuries. "I cannot be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." In that moment, he wasn't just defending himself. He was asserting Scotland's right to independence. Edward Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, would not be denied his vengeance. The sentence passed was the most severe in English law. Wallace was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This wasn't just execution, it was designed to be the ultimate humiliation and warning. On August 23rd, Wallace was stripped naked and dragged through the streets of London tied to horses, a journey of nearly 4 miles to Smithfield. The crowds that gathered to witness his execution were expecting to see a broken man. What they saw instead was defiance until the end. At the execution site, they hanged him, but not long enough to kill him, only to cause suffering. While still conscious, the executioners cut open his abdomen and pulled out his entrails, burning them before his eyes. Finally, his body was beheaded and cut into 4 parts. In a final act of intimidation, Wallace's head was dipped in tar to preserve it and placed on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a grim reminder to all who passed. His 4 limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth, the corners of a kingdom Edward believed he had finally subdued, but Edward gravely miscalculated. Instead of extinguishing the flame of Scottish resistance, Wallace's brutal execution only fanned it into a roaring blaze. His martyrdom transformed him from a military leader into something far more powerful, a symbol of Scottish identity and the unyielding pursuit of freedom. In towns and villages across Scotland, the news of Wallace's death spread not as a tale of defeat, but as a call to arms. The very brutality meant to strike fear instead ignited fury. Where Edward expected submission, he received renewed resistance. Within months, Robert the Bruce, who had once wavered between loyalty to England and Scotland, fully committed to the cause of Scottish independence. Wallace's sacrifice had removed all ambiguity about what Scottish submission to English rule truly meant. 7 years later, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Bruce would complete what Wallace had started, securing Scottish independence that would last for centuries. So while Wallace's body was broken, his spirit proved indestructible. His final defiance in Westminster Hall and his courage at Smithfield transformed a military defeat into a spiritual victory that continues to inspire the Scottish people to this day. Did you know that Wallace's enormous sword, measuring 5 feet and 4 inches long, required immense strength to wield effectively in battle? This legendary weapon symbolized not just his physical might, but the outsized impact he had on history, an impact that far outlived the man himself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into medieval history, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow history buffs, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more incredible stories from the past. And tell us in the comments, do you think the betrayal by Scottish nobles was Wallace's greatest obstacle, or was it something else? What would have happened if Wallace had received the united support of all Scottish lords? Though Wallace's body was broken that fateful day in London, something remarkable happened in the years that followed. His spirit, that defiant, unyielding commitment to Scottish freedom, seemed to spread like wildfire across the Highlands and Lowlands alike. William Wallace may have fallen, but his legacy was just beginning. Robert the Bruce, a nobleman who had once vacillated between the English and Scottish causes, found himself profoundly transformed by Wallace's sacrifice. The brutal execution wasn't just the end of a man. It was a clarion call that echoed across Scotland. Where Bruce had once seen political complexity, Wallace's martyrdom revealed a simple truth. Scotland would never truly thrive under English domination. In 1314, nearly 9 years after Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce led Scottish forces against the English at the Battle of Bannockburn. The odds were staggering. Some 30,000 English soldiers faced roughly 7,000 Scots. But the Scots carried something the English couldn't counter, the memory of William Wallace and what he stood for. As Bruce reportedly told his men before battle, "You have seen the wounds on Scotland's body. Today we heal them, or die in the attempt." The victory at Bannockburn was decisive. The Scottish spearmen broke the famed English cavalry, sending King Edward II fleeing for his life. This wasn't just a military triumph, it was the fulfillment of Wallace's dream. Scotland would maintain its independence for nearly 400 years afterward, until the Acts of Union in 1707. But Wallace's legacy extends far beyond that single battle. Throughout Scottish history, whenever independence seemed lost or national identity threatened, the name of Wallace would resurface. During the Jacobite risings, the Scottish Enlightenment, and even the modern independence movements, Wallace's example provided a spiritual touchstone, a reminder that freedom, once tasted, isn't easily forgotten. A fascinating historical curiosity. Wallace's legacy might have been very different without the 15th century blind poet known as Blind Harry. His epic poem, The Wallace, written around 170 years after Wallace's death, preserved and amplified the stories of Wallace's exploits. Though filled with historical inaccuracies and embellishments, this work kept Wallace's memory alive through the centuries when he might otherwise have faded into obscurity. In 1995, Wallace's story reached global audiences through the film Braveheart, directed by and starring Mel Gibson. The movie took substantial creative liberties. Wallace never wore blue face paint in battle, never had a romance with French Princess Isabella, who was actually just a child at the time, and the kilts depicted were centuries ahead of their time. Yet despite these historical inaccuracies, the film captured something undeniably genuine: the emotional truth of Wallace's struggle and the power of one person to ignite a movement. After the film's release, tourism to Wallace-related sites in Scotland increased dramatically. The Wallace Monument near Stirling saw visitor numbers double. A new generation discovered this medieval freedom fighter, and his story resonated with people worldwide who had never set foot on Scottish soil. Perhaps most telling is what happened in 2014 during Scotland's independence referendum. Both sides invoked Wallace's memory, one claiming to fulfill his legacy, the other suggesting that modern Scotland had already achieved what Wallace fought for. 700 years after his death, William Wallace remained relevant to the Scottish national conversation. What makes a true legacy? Is it carved in stone monuments or written in history books? For Wallace, it's something more elusive yet more powerful. His spirit lives in the very idea of Scotland itself. Each time someone stands against overwhelming odds, each time the powerless challenge the powerful, Wallace's defiant words in Westminster Hall echo across the centuries. "I cannot be a traitor, for I was never a subject." In Edinburgh Castle today sits the Stone of Destiny, an ancient symbol of Scottish sovereignty that was stolen by Edward Longshanks in 1296 and only returned to Scotland in 1996. Next to it, invisibly but unmistakably, stands the spirit of William Wallace, the commoner who became immortal by refusing to accept that freedom was not his birthright. From the battlefield at Stirling Bridge to the silver screen, from medieval ballads to modern politics, Wallace reminds us that true legacy isn't measured in victories won, but in the courage to fight battles that matter, even when victory seems impossible. Now let's take a moment to separate the man from the myth. If you've watched Braveheart, you might think you know William Wallace, the blue-faced warrior who shouted freedom as his final word and had a secret romance with a French princess. But how much of what we think we know about Wallace is actually true? The fascinating reality is that much of Wallace's story comes to us through layers of legend and deliberate myth-making. Our primary source about Wallace's life isn't a contemporary chronicle or official record. It's The Wallace, an epic poem written by a wandering bard known as Blind Harry in the 1470s, nearly 200 years after Wallace's death. Imagine playing a game of telephone that spans 2 centuries. That's essentially what happened with Wallace's story. By the time Blind Harry was composing his 15,000-line poem, Wallace had already begun transforming from historical figure into national legend. Harry collected folk tales, songs, and oral histories from across Scotland, weaving them into a narrative that was as much about inspiring 15th century Scots as it was about recording 12th century events. Blind Harry's poem portrays Wallace as a giant of a man, over 6.5 feet tall, a physical impossibility for most medieval men when the average height was around 5'7". The poem describes Wallace killing thousands of Englishmen with his bare hands and performing superhuman feats of strength. While Wallace was certainly a capable warrior, these embellishments served a purpose. They created a hero of mythic proportions when Scotland needed one most. One of the most iconic moments from Braveheart, Wallace crying freedom as his final word, has no historical basis whatsoever. Contemporary accounts of his execution make no mention of his last words. This dramatic flourish comes straight from Hollywood, not history. Similarly, the blue face paint known as woad had fallen out of use in Scotland centuries before Wallace's time. The Picts had indeed used such body paint, but they were ancient history by the 13th century. And what about Wallace's supposed affair with Isabella of France, the French princess and wife of Edward II? This romantic subplot that drives much of the film's drama is historically impossible. When Wallace was active in Scotland, Isabella was a child living in France who hadn't yet married Edward. She wouldn't arrive in England until 1308, 3 years after Wallace's execution. Then there's the matter of kilts and tartans. The Wallace clan tartan and the Highland dress shown in Braveheart didn't exist in Wallace's time. The distinctive patterned clan tartans we associate with Scottish identity today weren't developed until the 1700s, and the modern kilt evolved much later than Wallace's era. Wallace would likely have worn the common dress of medieval Scottish warriors, a linen shirt covered by a padded gambeson and mail if he could afford it, with legs covered by wool hose or trews, not the Highland kilt depicted in the film. Perhaps most significantly, Wallace's motivation wasn't a personal vendetta over the murder of his wife, another invention for the film. Historical records make no mention of Wallace being married at all, although some historians believe he may have had a wife named Marion Braidfute, who was killed by the English. However, even this is based more on Blind Harry's poem than contemporaneous evidence. What we do know for certain about Wallace comes from a handful of contemporary sources, official English records of his trial, scattered Scottish chronicles, and a few letters. These paint a picture of a minor nobleman's son who became a brilliant military tactician and inspirational leader during a critical moment in Scottish history. The real Wallace was extraordinary enough without embellishment. In a feudal age rigidly defined by social hierarchy, he was neither a great lord nor an heir to significant lands. Yet he managed to unite elements of Scottish society across class lines, from peasants to knights to lesser nobles, in common resistance against English occupation. This achievement alone marks him as remarkable. A fascinating detail often overlooked. One of the few contemporary documents bearing Wallace's name is a letter he co-wrote to the Hanseatic League cities of Lubeck and Hamburg, encouraging trade relations with a free Scotland. This reveals a man thinking beyond battlefield tactics to economic strategy and international diplomacy, hardly the one-dimensional warrior of legend. So why does the myth-making matter? Because myths tell us as much about the people who create and preserve them as they do about their subjects. Each generation of Scots has found in Wallace what they needed, from medieval resistance fighter to romantic hero to modern nationalist icon. The malleability of his story has been key to its endurance. In separating myth from reality, we don't diminish Wallace. We see him more clearly as a man of his time who transcended the limitations of his birth and circumstances to change the course of history. Not a superhuman giant, but perhaps something more impressive, an ordinary man who achieved extraordinary things through courage, conviction, and strategic brilliance. The power of Wallace's actual story isn't that he was some mythic hero destined for greatness, but that he was a human being who chose to stand up when standing seemed impossible. That's not just better than fiction. It's the kind of history that still has the power to inspire us today. As we've journeyed through the life, death, and legacy of William Wallace, one thing becomes abundantly clear. He was far more than just a warrior with a massive sword. He was a living embodiment of an idea that has resonated across 7 centuries, that freedom is not granted by the powerful, but claimed by those willing to stand for it. Wallace's story transcends the boundaries of medieval Scotland. It speaks to something universal in the human spirit, the yearning to determine our own fate, to live according to our own values, to be free. From the American Revolution to the fight against apartheid in South Africa, from Gandhi's peaceful resistance to modern independence movements, echoes of Wallace's defiance can be found wherever people stand against overwhelming odds. Consider this remarkable historical connection. When the American founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, nearly 500 years after Wallace's execution, several of them, including Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, were of Scottish descent and likely knew Wallace's story well. The same spirit of defiance against a distant monarch that drove Wallace would later fuel a revolution across the Atlantic. Wallace's Scotland was a nation divided by clan rivalries and noble ambitions, yet he managed to unite enough of his countrymen behind a vision of something greater than themselves. In doing so, he teaches us that national identity isn't about bloodlines or borders. It's about shared values and common cause. His execution, intended as a gruesome warning, instead became a catalyst for the very independence movement Edward Longshanks sought to crush. There's a powerful lesson here. Ideas cannot be killed. They survive the scaffold, the sword, and the stake. They outlive kings and kingdoms. Wallace's life prompts us to ask ourselves difficult questions. What would we risk for our deepest beliefs? How far would we go to protect our homes and our freedoms? What legacy do we hope to leave for generations yet unborn? These aren't just historical curiosities. They're questions that define who we are as people. Perhaps the most profound testament to Wallace's impact is this. While Edward Longshanks is remembered primarily as the king who failed to subdue Scotland, Wallace, a man of relatively humble birth who never wore a crown, is remembered as the soul of Scottish resistance. Centuries later, his statue stands tall at the entrance to Edinburgh Castle, gazing out over a Scotland that still grapples with questions of identity and independence. In the end, Wallace reminds us that history isn't always made by those born to power. Sometimes it's shaped by those who simply refuse to bend when bending would be easier. Whether you see him as a freedom fighter or a rebel, a tactical genius or a martyred hero, his story continues to challenge and inspire us to consider what principles we would stand for, even in the face of overwhelming odds. If you've been captivated by this exploration of one of history's most enduring figures, I invite you to join us for more journeys into the past. Hit that like button if you've learned something new about the real William Wallace behind the Hollywood legend. Share this video with friends who appreciate history's greatest stories of courage and conviction. And make sure you're subscribed to the Medieval Archives so you never miss our upcoming videos on the forgotten heroes, shocking battles, and extraordinary lives of the medieval world. This is the Medieval Archives, where history comes alive one story at a time. Until our next historical adventure, remember Wallace's example. Some causes are worth fighting for, no matter the cost.